goes into subgroups, and that comes from working in awful venues with old analog consoles and really underpowered monitors. So the last thing you ever wanted to do was compress a channel because you would lose all your headroom in the monitors. So you had to leave all of the channels, as high gain as you can possibly get away with, the least amount of EQ that you can get away with, zero compression, just to try and get enough out of the monitors and then hack the group. So I used to, insert group, like find old graphic EQs that we had. I used to work in like Fibbers in York and found some old graphics and things like that and inserted them on the subgroups linked into a compressor. So just so I had, on, Soundcraft GB4 or something like that. So you've got no processing on the subgroups at all. So that gave me a bit of EQ and a bit of compression that then I could basically tune the channels to work in the wedges that were hugely underpowered and then basically just smash everything to pieces on the group. So now we're in a digital age. My show file's still the same. I mean, don't get me wrong, I obviously do a lot more work on the channels now, but everything, usually apart from the bass guitar, which goes straight to the main mix, but everything usually goes into subgroups, and it's not parallel. Everything's out of the mix into the subgroup. The subgroup goes to front of the house.
Yeah.
And then the only thing I do is I have subgroups in some DCAs, but not in others.
Okay.
So, for example, if I push the drum DCA, I'm pushing the channels further into compression. So I've got a mono kick group, a mono snare group, a stereo tom group, and a stereo overhead group. So if I push the drum DCA up, it pushes things heavier into compression, and the snare drum reverb is in the snare drum subgroup as well. So that gets the same compression. But then guitars or whatever, the group is in the DCA, because I use a lot of graphic EQs over guitars. That's pretty much what I do. I'm very much a believer of there's things that you create and there's things you recreate. You stick a microphone on a drum kit, it doesn't sound good until you've done what you do to it. You put a mic on a guitar cab, it should sound pretty good straight away because that's their voice. It's the same as a singer singing down a mic, that's their voice.
Yeah.
So I don't want to start hacking parametric EQs and things on guitars, so I'll just use a graphic just to kind of get rid of all the nasty stuff that you get just from the physics of putting a microphone right on a guitar cab, because you never listen to that, you listen to it 10 feet away. So it's very much a kind of surgical thing just to get rid of the stuff that the microphone almost introduced. But, for me, the guitar should sound coming out of the PA exactly as it sounds coming out of the boxes, out of the amp rather. So as I say, that going back to what we're saying, if I lift the guitar DCA for a solo, I don't want to push that further into EQ. So I don't want that to start chopping even further. So the subgroup will lift with the DCA. And then again, depending on the vocalist, sometimes I'll push him into compression, sometimes I won't, sometimes. So, I'll pretty much, when I'm mixing a show, so on a D-Live, for example, the left-hand fader bay is always my backline, everything else. The center fader bay is all my vocals, my 2 drum reverb returns, and a long delay send. And then on the right-hand side, I'm just constantly flicking between DCAs and subgroups. And it's always the same DCAs, it's always the same subgroups, and it's muscle memory. And I'm just constantly, changing volume of vocals isn't a case of pushing the fader up, it's a case of balancing the DCA and then balancing the subgroup. And so they're not volume controls, you know what I mean? I'm changing how things react as well at the same time. So I'm constantly shifting between DCAs and groups to get a kind of volume change, so... But that's the most complex thing that I do.
Well, because the other thing is, for a man who's got quite a lot of outboard, you don't take a lot out, do you? Most of it's on board the console.
I don't really take anything out more. I have an LM44 and a Crane Song head.
And the Crane Song you use over here?
Just on the mast.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't even need to see it. There's 3 knobs on it and they're all set at number 4. And it never changes. It's just a magic box. Shouldn't tell people that. That's my secret.
That's a Yeah, I know, but it's a secret that comes at a price, isn't it?
But no, that came from. I was trying to remember this the other day, and I'm sure I'm sure it was a good mate of mine, a guy called Steve Taylor, who mixes 30 Seconds to Mars at the moment. And I was doing a band called The Blackout years ago, and we were opening for Blink-182. And Steve was mixing All American Rejects on a profile. And we were using his profile. And there was this unit underneath with these massive meters on, and it looked awesome. And I didn't know what it did. But I just thought, you know, it's literally sat over there, one of them. But and I remember just halfway through the tour saying, "Oh, what does that do?" And he was like, "Oh, it's just like a kind of tape, simply bypass it." So, yeah, I know. So I flicked it off, and because it's technically a mastering processor, it fades in and fades out. And I turned it off, and it was literally like someone just drop kicked the desk off a cliff. Everything just completely fell apart because I didn't know, I didn't put this thing on, so I built the whole mix going into this thing, and then only afterwards asked what it did, and it probably only took about 2 or 3 seconds for it to fade back in, but it felt like about 18 minutes, and it was the worst thing in the world. And then ever since that moment, I had to own one. They were always about £4,500, and I could never afford one. Then over time they've got a bit cheaper, and then I ended up buying like an X-Demo B-stock one.
Have you asked Rob Clark whether he'll emulate one?
Every time I see him, just thinking, you know, what outboard are you using and why are you using it? So, you know, it's. But I mean, I think what was I using with AFI last year? You know, I started off the tour with a Manley Voxbox into a Distressor, main vocal, and then we had I had a Smart C2 over the master as well as 2 Crane songs. So I was using them as DA converters out, the AES out the console. First one was doing left-right, second one was doing sub-fill. Because it's nice to just be able to push the settings a little bit harder on the subs-end. And we just kept having problems. Like the Manley was wonderful because Dave's vocals are a really hard one to do. He's very softly spoken. So a lot of microphones, and more than the mic, the preamp I found would make him sound like I have a lisp,
right?
Because the S's are so soft.
Yeah.
So I ended up wanting to wind HF in, but obviously then you just kill yourself. But with that Manley EQ on the Voxbox, you've got the HF section from the Massive Passive, which I'm not sure how it works, but it's one of those kind of magic EQs, like a Pultec thing, where you can dial in 15 dB of 10K and it doesn't feed back.
Yeah.
And it just all of a sudden goes and breathes, and then all of a sudden his diction came out and everything, you know. And so that was a kind of a magic one for me. But halfway through the tour, we started, you know, there's a ton of tubes in it, started getting noisy, and it got to the point where it was causing me more hassle than not. So we turned up to, you know, wherever we were, and I just thought, right, I'm going to bypass it all and just go back in the box, back in the, you know, in the desk. And that was, I can't remember where we were. It was somewhere in the US, and I put everything back in the console, replaced the Distressor with the 1176, played around with the tube preamp settings and things like that, and actually just found a little bit of a drive thing kind of helped. And then doing that kind of Pultec thing on the top end where you're boosting and cutting at the same time and finding, and then that was it. That was the last gig I ever used outboard gear on, and racks went home. So now I literally, there's a D Live, and then the master output goes through the Crane song and into an LM44, and that's it.
So what are the compressors you're using on the D Live? Did you use all of them?
Pretty all of them, yeah.
Yeah.
Drums is the 160, the 16T, and I use the parallel bus on that, and normally bring in the dry, hitting it quite hard at about 4:1, so there's about 6 dB gain reduction, and then bringing in probably about up to -10, and that just gives it a really nice kind of tight thwack, and then, you know, a little bit 3 to 4 dB of makeup gain, and it just really tightens everything up. Opto comp on the snare is great. 160 VU on the bass. I use the Dynamite compressor on guitars.
Okay.
I think that's fun. On distorted guitars, it's amazing. But just because you got the automatic gain thing, you know, it's just a little bit of gain reduction, but it just kind of adds a thickness and a fullness on the guitars. And then dependent on who it is, Opto 1176 or LA2 on the vocals.
Yeah.
And then Dyne everywhere, because I'm a massive fan of dynamic EQ.
I'm just thinking now, if you ever saw me mix a gig after this conversation, it'd be like you and your mentor, don't look at this console.
But it's that thing that the more, and don't get me wrong, it's always fun when you go back to a festival and there's an XL4 there or something like that.
Yeah.
But then you're back in that thing of, what could I compress? And I saw a mate of mine had a big old rant on Facebook a few months ago, and he was like, people don't do it right anymore, and you used to gig, I used to do gigs and we had 8 compressors and it sounded great. And it's like, I'm sure it did, but the public's perception of how things should sound has changed. And records sound different now. Everything, bands going to a studio now, and instead of working with a producer and coming out of the studio going, oh my god, I can't believe I sound like that. They come out of the studio now with a computer that's made the record and go, oh shit, I need to learn to sound like that. And it is so super, super polished. And there's all these little studios now churning out records that are like sound that we'd have dreamed of like 10, 15 years ago. But it's all just computerized now, and it's a lot of records that actually don't sound anything like the band. But the public's perception is that is how music sounds now. So the detail and everything of live sound has to follow that. So yes, gigs, I'd love to have seen a Led Zeppelin gig or something like that, and I'm sure it would have sounded spectacular on 8 channels, but you can't get away with that now. Look at Led Zeppelin when Mick did it at the O2. It's on an XL8 and there's a ton of stuff everywhere, and they didn't mix Led Zeppelin on 8 channels in the O2 because it's moved on. I'm sure both gigs sounded stunning, but so for me it's like, well, if I went back to an XL4 now, it's, well, I've got to choose what I want to compress. But actually, if you look at my channel on a D-Live, my show file on D-Live or whatever, and I've got 60 inputs coming in or whatever, between all the there's compression on most of the channels, there's all compression and on all the outputs, there's loads of EQ on the outputs, there's dynamic EQ everywhere, because it gives you the option to have 15 arms, which we don't have. But all of a sudden, if I've got a ton of dynamic EQ taking care of things and the show's automating itself, but to a point where I'm still in control, but I've got all these other people doing things for me that I couldn't have done.
Yeah.
It can only be better,
Yeah. So the Dyne that gets used. What are you using? Is that on your groups, your inputs, everything? Yeah.
It's on all the drums. That the harder and the softer the drums are hit, it reacts differently. So the softer the drums are hit, it's still just adding a little bit of top end and bottom end to keep them full and a little bit of attack. And then the harder they dig in, the more of the mid range is pulling out, so they sound nice and tight and focused. But then it's when it's then putting it back in as they drop away again. And then you can be a lot less savage with gates as well. It's on bass guitar is an absolute must. It's on my guitars just for that kind of whoomfiness that you get in guitars. That kind of 100, 200 hertz thing.